Our speaker for tonight is no other than one of POWERinU's director, in fact, President, Benji Garcia. Benji has dedicated his life to helping others flourish. His priorities are clear: family, spiritual life, and profession. Benji treasures the time he spends with his wife of 35 years, especially now that their children have grown up. As a devout Catholic, he dedicates his time to his spiritual growth through receiving the sacraments, prayer, scripture reading, retreats, and community service. Benji's professional journey began 37 years ago as a nature consultant. Over the past 3 decades, he has navigated the corporate HR landscape, gaining a wealth of experience and knowledge, working in multicultural environment, and in late 2017, his journey came full circle when he co-founded POWERinU Training and Coaching Philippines. While he continues to help clients achieve their goals through HR consulting and training, Benji's true passion lies in coaching. He views coaching as a powerful tool to help individuals reach their highest potential. His commitment to learning is evident in his numerous certifications, including Marshall Goldsmith's Stakeholder-Centered Coaching, Advanced Professional Coaching, the Breakthrough Coaching Core Program, the Accelerating Coaching Excellence Core Course, and he is also a Genus International Emotional Intelligence Certified Practitioner. Everyone, let us welcome our speaker for tonight, Benji Garcia.
Thank you very much, Penny, and good evening to everyone. Thank you for the introduction and for hosting today's webinar. Now let's get started with this webinar. Although you may not be aware of it, we tell ourselves stories and make judgments on situations that we encounter. When we find ourselves in situations where the stakes are high, emotions are high, and there are disagreements, our ability to take control of our stories in our head significantly impact the outcome of the situation. I became interested in this topic because of its importance for me professionally as a coach, as a trainer, consultant, but also from a personal standpoint. So today, I will share with you the things that I've learned about our inner stories or narratives and the impact it has in the quality of our relationships. Let's get started with the picture that you see on the screen. Perhaps you are familiar with this type of traffic that we encounter typically in EDSA or in C5, where the traffic is so heavy that you are traveling at a snail's pace. I've experienced this quite a lot, although lately, fortunately, not as much, since most of my activities are virtual, or I have the opportunity to avoid the rush hour most of the time. Not always, but most of the time. However, as I drove along EDSA or C5, typically there would be another car coming from my left or right, where the driver tries to cut into my lane. So if you have experienced that situation, I'm wondering what went through your head, your mind, and what did you do? I have to confess that although charity dictates that I would allow the other car to cut in, there are probably more times that I at least tried to prevent the other car from getting into my lane. I even felt annoyed with the other driver. I would tell myself something like, serves him right for trying to steal my lane. Quite embarrassing, but that's actually the truth. Let's look at another situation. Perhaps in the office, you and your colleague have been working on an important project that has fallen significantly behind schedule. In preparing for your meeting, you devoted the previous day identifying the root causes of the delay and formulating a plan of action to quickly address the situation. However, during your meeting with your colleague, he starts questioning you about the actions that you did or did not take leading to the current project status. So again, how would you respond to him or her? What was going through your mind? What were you feeling at that particular time? In life, we encounter challenging situation where how we handle ourselves makes a big impact on the outcome. In this webinar, we will focus on those difficult conversations that typically arise in these situations, such as the two that I've mentioned. But let's start with trying to get a feel for your own experience as far as difficult situations or difficult conversations are concerned. I will actually now do a poll, and I'd like you to spend a bit of time, few seconds, to input your responses. There are two questions. Let me just read the first one. So the first one is, in what situations do you experience this type of difficult conversation? So I have a few items to choose from, and this is a multiple choice poll. And there's even an others at the bottom, in case your experience does not fall into any of the items that are mentioned here. Please take a few seconds and input your responses, please. I think you can also see the second question is more about how frequent you encounter this. So again, in this particular case, just choose one answer. All right, I think we can end the poll and just show the results. So you can see here that there's varied responses, although you have implementing change as one of the highest ones, as well as dealing with crisis, of course. But you do have answers related to negotiation, performance discussion, and team-related issues. What about the second one? So here, okay, I think you have a slight majority saying it actually happens to them several times a day. And some people said it's once or twice a month, or once or three times in a week, so more frequently. So some of you are experiencing this quite a lot. 6 basically you're saying that, and then you have a few that are not experiencing it as often as possible. Okay, thank you for sharing those responses. All right. So in this webinar, we will talk about several items here that are mentioned on the screen. First, we will learn that in a conversation or a difficult situation, or practically any situation that we find ourselves, there are actually 3 types of conversations or categories that are actually ongoing. These are inner stories or inner conversations that we are having with ourselves. So we will learn that. And the second one is we will explore the nature of stories and how this impact our emotions and subsequent actions, how we respond as a result of that. Speaking of these stories, there are actually 3 types of stories that we tell ourselves. This is different from the 3 conversations that I first mentioned. And these are kind of the dramas that we actually play out in our minds. And most importantly, learning about this kind of stories that we tell ourselves, how do we actually take control? What can we do to actually control our stories so that we can actually have a more productive conversation, or ideally reaching the goals that we have set for ourselves? Okay. So I think consistent with the poll responses, when you talk about difficult conversations or difficult situations, the common ones that are mentioned are those where the discussion is emotionally charged. There is conflict that arises in a conversation. It can happen as a result of delivering or receiving, I guess, negative feedback or bad news. Conversations which require self-disclosure, when we have to open up our thoughts and our ideas, our feelings, particularly, and conversations about change. So you'll notice many of these have actually been covered in the poll, and many of you, I think, have actually indicated experiencing some of this or a variety of different conversations. So to start off, let's understand this in the context of what I call the stimulus response model, which I assume many of you are actually familiar with. Simply speaking, this model tells us that when we experience or observe a situation, we make a choice in our response. That's the middle box, which is called freedom to choose. And in that middle box, we can either react, which refers to our automatic response, which may be driven by our emotions, a reflex action, or a habit. And this response may not always serve us well. On the other hand, we can respond with a clear intent, clear objective, which is based on our values, which typically helps us in having a much better outcome in our conversation. Talking about the three conversations or the three categories that take place in our mind whenever we are in a challenging conversation. These are the what happened conversation, the feelings conversation, and the identity conversation. Coming from Douglas Stone and Company, who prepared the book Difficult Conversations. Let's talk about each one very quickly. In the what happened conversation, there are disagreements to what has happened or what should happen. You talk about who said what, who did what, and many such details. The thing with the what happened conversation is that there are actually three traps that we need to be aware of. The first one is called the truth assumption. Typically, we think that we know all the facts in the situation and that our interpretation of the situation is correct. In other words, you start off by saying, I am right, the other person is wrong. In the intention assumption, we talk about our intentions and that of the other person. Why is that important? Because what I think about your intentions will affect how I think of you and ultimately influence how our conversation will go. Unfortunately, when we perceive that we are confronted with opposition or disagreement, our intentions or motives tend to degenerate to any of the following. We start focusing on winning the conversation, proving that we are right, saving face, wanting to look smart, keeping the peace, avoiding conflict, or maybe even punishing the other person. The third trap is called the blame frame, which, as the term actually connotes, when we start focusing on the search for who is to blame. Why? That's a trap because it actually triggers defensiveness, particularly with the other person. Let's move to the feelings conversation. When you talk about the feelings conversation, you are actually talking about questions and answers related to emotions, such as, what emotions am I experiencing right now? Are my feelings valid? Are they appropriate? You might even be wondering, should I acknowledge or deny these feelings? Should I express them or should I try to bottle them up? You might even be thinking about, what do I do with the other person's feelings as you process all of this inner conversation. Last but not the least is the identity conversation. It's also a conversation we have with ourselves about what the particular situation means to us. What impact might it have in terms of our self-image or well-being or self-worth? This identity conversation may begin even before you have the difficult conversation, all the way to even after you've already had that conversation. Thing is, this kind of conversation can actually make us lose our composure, take us off center, or make us become anxious. And in the process, we may end up losing confidence, self-confidence, losing concentration, even to the point that we might lose our train of thought in terms of what we're going to say next. So these are really the three categories or the three conversations that really happen as we are having an external conversation with the other person or persons. Now that we've talked about these three categories, we will now look at how we can relate them to the stimulus response model. This is a modified version of that, adapted from the storytelling process of Joseph Grenny and company, as captured in their book, Crucial Conversations. Again, same as the stimulus model conversation, we experience or observe a situation. What happens is that we start telling ourselves stories or make judgments. And these judgments impact how we feel, the emotions that we encounter. And all of these emotions will actually influence the actions that we will take. So for the rest of the conversation, we will focus on the yellow box, which is what we call the freedom to choose. Talking about stories, let's understand what influences our stories. The first one is actually our personal beliefs, which shape personal beliefs and assumptions which shape how we interpret events. The second one is past experiences that can create biases and influence our current perceptions. All taken together, you could say that culture covers many of the past experiences and personal beliefs and assumptions that we have, and thus influences our inner stories. We often jump to conclusions as a result of that based on limited information, and we end up focusing on what confirms our existing beliefs. And that's what we call ladder of inference and selected perception. Stephen R. Covey said that we see the world not as it is, but as we are, or as we are conditioned to see it. So such is the power of stories that we tell ourselves, because it shapes our reality. Let's talk a little bit more about these stories that run through our head. Firstly, these are unconscious storytelling that we may be saying internally. We may not even be aware of it. Oftentimes, though, we may notice that we have already judged the other person's character or put a label on the other person. I remember in one of our leadership workshops early this year, in the Q&A part of that workshop, one of the participants, a manager, actually stood up to ask something like, how should I deal with the black sheep in my team? So right there in his statement, he's already made a label about a member of his team that he actually called a black sheep, together with, I think, what we typically associate with the term black sheep. Second is, given the same set of facts, there can actually be almost an infinite number of interpretations that we can create as far as the information or the facts that are in front of us. Therefore, we need to take care of controlling the story, our stories. Otherwise, it will actually take control of us. You know, we are actually very capable of creating invented or clever stories. And there are actually three common stories that we tell ourselves. The first one is the victim story, also called, "It's not my fault. I'm just an innocent bystander." So here we're talking about blaming external factors for our problems, for the situation. The second is called the villain story. I think you can guess what that is. It means it's all your fault. It's the other person's fault. So you're seeing the other person as the source of the trouble. You know, interestingly, when you talk about the victim story and the villain story, when we make mistakes, we tend to tell the victim story by claiming our intentions were innocent and pure. On the other hand, when the other person does something that hurt us or inconveniences us, we tell the villain story and invent nasty or evil intentions or assume evil intentions on the other person, or even exaggerate the flaws that the other person has based on the effect of the actions that they've taken on us. And the third one is actually the helpless story. So it's about feeling powerless to change the situation. We convince ourselves that we are powerless to do anything to help or improve the situation. It may go something like, if an issue came up in my work and I would think about bringing up the issue with my boss, I might say, if I bring the issue up to my boss, he might just get mad or blame me, even if you have not experienced that kind of treatment from your boss or even observed your boss displaying such behavior. So that would be an example of a helpless story. We end up freezing and doing nothing. As I was preparing for this webinar and going through these three stories, I cannot help but recall stories that I would tell myself falling into any of these three when I was a young boy, or as I was growing up. I guess in reality, those are things that we may have done when we were young, but hopefully as we grow older, we would at least be telling less of such stories. In my case, now that I'm a senior citizen, hopefully not a lot, or perhaps it's something it's in my blind spot. Now that we've talked about the different elements, the different aspects of our inner stories or our inner narratives, we go to the more important part. What do you do to take control of your stories? What do we do to take control of our stories? Well, there are two basic steps. The first one is to pause and examine our story. And the second one is to restate the story. Let me explain each one. Pausing at a point in time where you would probably rather react is something difficult, but that's a quick initial step that you need to take. Be still and pause and reflect. Examine our behavior, particularly if we are already in the midst of very strong emotions. We need to ask ourselves what we are really doing. A question might be something like, am I acting out my concerns instead of talking them out? In other words, you're displaying certain behaviors that are rather than trying to speak out in a more civil way. You're actually acting them out. Second is to name our feelings and our emotions. This is a challenge, I think, at least for many literatures that I've read. Learning to accurately identify and name our emotions is an important step. We can ask something like, what emotions am I feeling right now? Or what emotions are encouraging me to act this way? As I said, our vocabulary for naming our emotions, I think, is an important element, particularly in this particular step. It also made me wonder that although this webinar is actually delivered in English, in reality, in my case, I would normally be speaking in the local language on a day-to-day conversation. And it made me actually think about my vocabulary for emotions in our local language, which I probably would have to admit is quite limited. And then identify our stories. What story am I telling myself that is creating this emotion? So this follows after naming our emotion, understanding what's behind that. What is the story that's conjuring up in my mind? Separate the fact from the invented story. What is actually something that I am sure about, and what is an assumption that I'm actually making? A possible question might be something like, what have I seen or heard that supports this story? Or even more important, what have I seen or heard that conflicts with my story? Is there another way to look at the situation? The last question is actually one of the favorite coaching questions. Is there another way to look at the situation? And then be aware and check if you are actually telling any of the three clever or invented stories that we talked about a while ago. Are you playing the victim role? Are you using the villain story? Are you actually acting out the helpless story? Once we get all of these things cleared up, we now focus on restating the story. And again, a couple of possible guide questions as we think about this. The first one is, how have I contributed to the situation? I think for me, this is sometimes this is oftentimes an important question because it's often neglected how I have actually contributed. Perhaps coming from a blame frame, I talk about blaming the other person instead of also doing an examination of myself to say, perhaps I have failed to do something or I did something that made things worse. The second question is also very important when you start evaluating what the other person has done. Why would a reasonable, rational, decent person do what he did? This is looking at the actions or statements of the other person or the other party. The assumption, of course, is that you're talking to a reasonable, rational, and decent person. The third one is also very important as you try to focus now on what you want to get out of the situation. What do I really want? This is to check whether your intention or motives have actually degenerated to wanting to win the argument at all costs, proving that you are smarter or proving that you are right, rather than what is really important. What was the original goal when you had the conversation? So what do I really want for me, for others, perhaps for my team, for my organization, also including for the relationship? If the conversation or the situation happens to be somebody that you work with closely, maybe part of your team, or maybe a family member or a personal friend. And having done that, having answered those, you can now ask yourself, what can I do right now to move toward what I really want? So it's really about reminding ourselves, what do we want to get out of that particular conversation? So what can I do right now to move the conversation positively towards the objective that I originally had? Having gone through this particular examination and retelling of our stories, we are now able to choose the kind of response that we would have so that we can move closer to what we were looking to achieve in that particular conversation. So, as takeaways for this particular webinar, I'd like to identify three things. One is becoming aware of our internal stories and feelings help us to make effective choices in our actions. So we're not being reactive or driven by our strong emotions or a degraded intention or motive. The second is to emphasize the importance of mindfulness. It is easier said than done when you talk about pausing and evaluating and asking yourself some of those questions. But that's an important step, being able to develop our mindfulness so we can pause, reflect, and choose our response wisely in a particular situation. And the last part is actually for us to desire to grow in humility, respect, and curiosity. Humility, because we need to recognize that we likely do not have the full and accurate understanding of a situation, or that we may have even contributed to the situation in terms of what we did or what we failed to do. Respect, because we want to remember that whatever the situation is, the other person is also a human being that deserves the respect. And that's one of the key elements for us to be able to continue having a productive conversation. And the last one is curiosity instead of judgment, because curiosity together with humility and respect leads to learning. So in closing, what we covered in this webinar is what I believe to be the critical aspect in successfully navigating a difficult or challenging conversation. Another aspect that is also important is how we implement the decision or the action or response that we have selected. But I think that would have to be a topic for another webinar. And on that note, let me turn the floor back to Penny for questions.
Thank you, Benji. I learned a lot from your talk about the victim stories, the villain stories, the helpless stories. Guilty of many of the three victim. It's what did they do? Villain, it's your fault. And helpless, what can I do? It's the situation. So many of us, I am sure, have had this experience already. And I also
Same with me.
and in just in traffic, the first one that you presented, are you the victim? Are you the villain? Will you allow the person to cut in? Yes, or not? You raised a very good point about the coachee that you had as saying that there's a black sheep in the team. So he already labeled the team member. And the key takeaways that you mentioned, being aware of our inner stories and feelings, and how mindfulness is very important, and desire to grow in humility, respect, and curiosity. So learning a lot from uh, that talk of yours. Okay, so we have some questions already in our chat and I'll ask the first question. Thank you, Ed, for asking the question. How do we prevent people from making stories that will serve a hidden agenda?
The answer to that is we cannot. The key point also in the webinar, that the topic that I talked today, is that you focus on what you can control. And essentially, the only thing that we can control is ourselves. However, as I mentioned in closing, I did not cover the part around, so how do you actually put the decision, the action in practice? And that's another topic in itself, because it's not enough that you understand these things, because it's important that you do that, because then you can make a wise decision. But then again, how do you actually implement? What actions do you take? And I think in relation to Ed's question, this is about listening, about empathy, and trying to understand the other person. And if the other person has a hidden agenda, then it's difficult to really control that. But in the process of perhaps building trust, then you'll be able to help the other person open up.
I like what you said, Benji. You can't control others, you can only control yourself.
Yes.
That's so true. Your anger, you cannot control the anger of another person. You can only control your own.
Yes. And the part that I was hinting at is, well, if the other person is emotional, then your action has to be in such a way that you will not be triggered by the other person, because that's usually what happens, right? It can be very infectious. So there are also ways by which you can actually continue to manage your own emotion. Because if you are triggered by the emotion of the other person or the response, then dalawa na kayo. Then you've actually been hooked into that kind of unproductive, I would say, conversation. And that's an important element. You need to be aware constantly of what's going on inside you, so you do not get hooked or triggered.
Hmm. But Benji, in reality, sometimes we we speak before we think. So
Yes,
we emotional outburst kagad, no, instead of pausing. So
yes,
what can you recommend that we do to be able to be aware of pausing so that we don't make the conflict even bigger?
yes. Good question. Maybe the one caveat I failed to mention in my webinar is that what I have actually shared is simple, but it's not easy. It takes a lot. Firstly, it takes a lot of practice. It takes a lot of self-awareness, I would say. That's what I mean by mindfulness. So it's about becoming self-aware, noticing. I guess that's the other word that I would like to use. In coaching, we use that a lot. Noticing what's going on in your body, because there are indicators, physical indicators, that we can sense if we are paying attention to the kind of feeling or emotion that we're having. It's not just an emotion that suddenly pops up in our head. Actually, there typically are physical manifestations that even come even before that. Having said that, there will always be situations where you get surprised. That's the reality. Kasi to me, I was thinking about it. It can be very tiring if you will have to be on sort of like alert mode every single time. There will always be situations, I think, where we will get surprised. So the important piece then would then still be recognizing that we've already been triggered, that we can still try to pause and recover. That is still possible.
How difficult is that, Benji?
Quite difficult without practice. And that's the one thing that we're not able to do in this webinar because conceptually, we've identified we already become aware, but it's a skill. It requires effort to actually do that. And as I said, we can exercise a bit of self-compassion also. I'm not sure if it's even possible to do that every single moment because sometimes we get surprised, no? We get blindsided on something that was not expected. So it's possible, but you can recover.
Okay. Thank you very much, Benji. We have another question. I am here at the chat box. We have been talking again from Ed. We have been talking about building our stories either for a good or bad agenda. If detected as a bad story, then we can counter with another story. So it's a comment.
Okay, thank you, Ed.
May I share, Benj?
Sure.
And I think one way to stop and pause is just inhale, exhale. Inhale, exhale, just the breathing. If
Right.
you're triggered, just inhale, exhale. When you inhale, please don't forget to exhale.
Yes, that's really the basics when you talk about mindfulness, right?
Mhm.
Yes.
Okay.
So I think it was Elaine who mentioned Daniel Kahneman's system one, system two thinking. Yes, when you talk about automatic response, that is really system one thinking. And system two is about stopping, evaluating things based on your values, based on your principles.
Yes. And I think we have a lot of autopilots in our daily lives. Sometimes you autopilot driving to work, and sometimes you don't you autopilot honking the car already or allowing people to pass. So
Yes.
as you said, we need to be self-aware, we need to stop and think, and when to respond and how to respond. And I like the desire to grow in humility, respect, and curiosity. Okay, another question, Benji. Is it possible that a person is stuck with his own perspective even after knowing about the concepts in this webinar?
Definitely. Sometimes we are in what we call a blind spot. We are not even aware that we are actually stuck. And sometimes that's where another person can actually help us. Getting feedback from another person can be very helpful. So if somebody you have, someone who is a close friend who can be very open and yet compassionate with you, that's an opportunity for a conversation to have someone basically reflect or mirror to you what you are actually doing because you may not actually be aware. Another alternative, which is somewhat of a plug, is you can engage a services of a coach because that's what basically coaches do. Part of what they do is to help you see how you are actually behaving or what you are actually thinking. What are the things that might get you unstuck? So you can have those. There are those ways by which you can actually become aware or get unstuck with certain beliefs or things that you may not even realize.
Okay, getting unstuck is not easy as well.
Oh yeah,
So, so you don't even know if you're stuck. You're right.
that's right. And there's also that piece of stubbornness for certain beliefs because only you can change what you believe in, right? So
Mhm.
much of what I mentioned in the webinar is actually neutral in terms of values. That's a good point, I think, that was mentioned because although I talked about humility, respect, in closing, I wanted to highlight that. But the reality is the process itself is actually neutral to that. Ultimately, you inject your own beliefs and values. So if you insist on, for example, if your belief, and this is an extreme, is that might is right, then you will take a very different approach to your action. That means that your belief first has to change, because otherwise you will end up being in a very potentially end up in a very confrontational conversation, because that's the belief, that's the underlying belief that you have.
And some of the underlying values may come from childhood.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Okay. Some of the limiting beliefs may come from childhood as well. There's
Yes.
another question here when about dealing with unexpected, unwanted events and conflicts. Do you think we need to choose our battles so as not to resort to emotional exhaustion?
I think that's a very good and wise point. Not everything is worth winning. Um, on a personal domestic point of view, it's also been a truism that I've heard. Sometimes it's better to be kind than to be right. So you don't need to win every battle. And sometimes pursuing a higher value, a higher virtue, I would say, is probably the right way to go. Because you also have to talk about an outcome that might be important to you. For example, if really maintaining relationship is important to you with that person, then sometimes it is better really, well, not sometimes, oftentimes it is really better to be kind than to be right.
To be kind and to be right. We have a comment here, Benj. True humility is one of the most effective values Sir Benj advised me. Coming from Ava.
Oh, thank you, Ava.
So we're not just asking questions, we're also giving you feedback. Good
Thank you for
feedback.
the feedback. Appreciate it.
Okay, another question from Ping Roque. How would we know that we are becoming mindful and not just giving up just to get the difficult conversation over?
Yeah. Good question also. Thank you for that question, Ping. Um, the way I learned to interpret this mindfulness includes something like uh, noticing, being able to notice the thoughts that are coming through our mind, um, thinking, putting ourselves like a third person, stepping out of our role and observing ourselves from the outside as if we were a third person. That is a skill that can be developed. As I said, at least my approach is to develop mindfulness. Um, and as you pointed out, Penny, it can be also as simple as doing some breathing exercises that allows you to slow down the mind, to slow down and observe, because that's really what you need to be able to do. It is to slow down and notice what is happening to your body, what is happening to your emotion, what are the thoughts that are coming through your head. I like one metaphor that I read just recently. It described it as noticing or being mindful can be described as going into a sushi restaurant, and where do you have that sushi train? I don't know if people are familiar with that. There's a conveyor and there's all kinds of dishes that are served by the chef that goes around. So you think of it as, you know, your thoughts are those sushi dishes that are actually being served up. You as the customer, you're looking at that. You don't necessarily need to choose every idea, every thought that comes into your sort of your point of view, that you will actually be able to see it. You can choose the good ones and reject the ones that you do not like. I'm not sure if I answered the question, Ping.
I'm sure you did. I will not choose a sushi. Okay. All good, sir, according to Ping. There's another question here from Ermeline. How do we unlearn these limiting beliefs?
Okay. Well, limiting beliefs basically, first of all, it's really about whether they are still serving us well. Because the reason they became beliefs is because somehow, through our past experiences, we believe that they have actually served us well. Whatever those beliefs and corresponding actions were, as a result of the belief. So at some point in the past, we've learned those, and it probably helped us, at least from our perspective. So how do you unlearn? It's quite, how do you call it? It's about challenging those beliefs, recognizing now what impact it actually has on our current situation, and even more importantly, in terms of where we want to go. So it's really going back to what effect does it have? Is it helping us still at this point in time? But I agree with you, it is actually quite difficult. Oftentimes, you'd have something like a very powerful experience that will wake you up that says, you know, I used to think of the world this way, but because of this experience, now I have a different idea. Now I have a different perspective. Perhaps it's also one way that coaching can help you. Someone to actually challenge your beliefs. But even in coaching, you'd need somebody who's really capable to have a conversation that will take you deep into a belief. Because oftentimes, the starting point of most coaching is about what's the result that you want?
Yeah.
What is the activity that you want? When you start talking about beliefs, it typically is something that you hold sacred. And you might even, as a client of coaching, you might even resist or get mad at your coach for actually challenging a belief that you have, especially if you still firmly believe in that.
Oh, that's difficult.
It's
That is
difficult
difficult. Mhm.
because
Okay.
it's how do you call it? It's like, I would say, like getting into questions of identity, because you identify so much with the belief that when that is challenged, it's almost like your own self image is actually being challenged.
Therefore, perhaps they need a coach.
And you may need a coach.
Okay. Okay. We're running out of time. So thank you very much, Benji. We learned a lot from your webinar today. I learned a lot from it as well. So thank you for this. As you mentioned, there's a part 2 on this one.